upon a big black Spanish cat. "Not so fast," cried the Yellow Dwarf. "I am your rival, so do not vent your wrath upon the Desert Fairy. I claim the princess for my bride, and in token of her promise to me, on her finger you will find a ring made of a single red hair." "It is false," cried the King of the Golden Mines, and he made a dash, sword in hand, for the Yellow Dwarf. But quick as thought the dwarf drew his sword also, and he rode forward on his Spanish cat. Well, they fought long and fiercely, but the king was not able to overcome the dwarf, because he was protected by two enormous giants, who stood one on each side of him. Suddenly the Desert Fairy stepped forward, and on her head was a wreath of big curling snakes. Raising her lance, she struck the princess such a blow that Allfair sank fainting into her mother's arms. "Revenge!" shouted the King of the Golden Mines, and he rushed to the aid of his love, as a brave man would, of course. But alas, he was too late, for the dwarf had torn her from her mother's arms, lifted her onto his Spanish cat, and the next minute they were flying through the air beyond his reach. The poor king was so surprised that all he could do was to gaze up towards the clouds, and wonder what would happen next. Suddenly a mist gathered before his eyes, and he felt himself being carried up into the air also. Now you must know that the ugly old Desert Fairy had fallen madly in love with the King of the Golden Mines, and she had made up her mind that he should never marry Allfair, so she carried him off to secure him for herself. Up into the air they went, until they reached a gloomy cave. Then the fairy set him down, and restored his sight by means of her magic arts. "He is sure to fall in love with me," she cried to herself, "now that Allfair is safely out of the way." But it was not a bit of use, for she was so ugly that the king only looked the other way the whole time, and this made her very angry indeed. So the fairy tried another plan. She took the form of a beautiful maiden, and placed the king in a splendid chariot, drawn by two snow-white swans. Then she too stepped in, and together they sailed away through the air. "He'll never resist my charms this time," she said to herself. But she found out her mistake very soon, I can tell you. You see, although the fairy could change her form at will, her feet always remained the same, and the king caught sight of the two ugly webbed feet that looked as if they belonged to a griffin. So he was not deceived at all, and he knew her to be the Desert Fairy, in spite of the disguise. On and on they went, and once the king chanced to look downward. There he saw a castle built of bright polished steel, and on the balcony stood Allfair, weeping very bitterly. Allfair chanced to look upwards, and she spied the chariot drawn by the snow-white swans. Although it passed along very quickly, she could see the king seated inside with a lovely maiden, and as she did not know it was the Desert Fairy, she felt very jealous indeed. Soon the chariot alighted at a lonely palace, shut in by a wall of emeralds on one side, and the sea on the other. Well, the king just cast his eyes around the place, and made up his mind not to stay there long. "I'll escape somehow," he said to himself, and he did too before very long. He pretended to be in love with the Desert Fairy, and this pleased and flattered her so much that she began to treat him very kindly indeed. She even allowed him to walk alone on the seashore for half an hour each day. One morning, as the king stood upon the beach, he was surprised to see a charming mermaid rise up from the water. "King of the golden mines," she said, "I know your story, and have the power to set you free. I can also restore your Princess Allfair to you once more. Now, as I am an enemy of the Desert Fairy, I will do this for you." The king thanked her, of course, and the mermaid bade him set himself upon her tail, and away they sailed at full speed across the blue ocean, until they had gone many miles. "The princess, you must know," said the mermaid, "is being kept a prisoner by the Yellow Dwarf. She is in a bright steel castle, and in another hour we shall reach the place." On they went still farther, and at length the mermaid set the king down upon the seashore. "The rest of the journey," she said, "you must take alone, and you will have many enemies to fight before you reach the princess. But," she added, "I will present you with this magic sword, which will overcome everything, so long as you never let it out of your hand." The king took the sword, and thanked the mermaid again and again, and then he set out to seek the steel castle. But before he had gone 100 yards, 4 terrible griffins attacked him, and the king stood a good chance of being torn to pieces by their long claws. Just in time, however, he remembered his magic sword, and no sooner did the 4 griffins behold it than they sank to the ground, blinded by its brightness. After that it was an easy matter to cut off their heads, and the king went on his way again. Soon after he met 6 big dragons, and each one was covered with scales like cast iron. But by means of his magic sword the king was able to kill them also, and he hoped his troubles were nearly over. Alas! before he had gone many yards, 24 nymphs, all lovely as the sun, set themselves right in his path. "Our business," they said, "is to keep you from reaching the steel castle. If we let you pass, all our lives will be sacrificed. We have done you no harm, so do go back again, that our innocent lives may be spared." Well, the king scarcely knew how to act. It seemed a pity to destroy such lovely creatures, and yet get to the steel castle he must. "Strike! Strike!" cried a voice loudly, "or you will lose your princess forever." So his majesty destroyed the whole 24 of them, and at that moment the steel castle appeared in sight. On the balcony stood Allfair, just as she had been when he passed through the air in the chariot drawn by swans. "Princess," he cried, "your faithful lover has returned at last." "Faithful indeed," replied Allfair angrily. "You were not faithful when I saw you being carried through the air in company with a beautiful maiden." "Indeed I was," replied the king of the golden mines. "The maiden you saw was the wicked Desert Fairy. She carried me off to an island, and there I should be now, if a kind mermaid had not set me free." Then the king cast himself at her feet, but unfortunately he managed to drop the magic sword over the balcony. Out popped the ugly Yellow Dwarf from behind a big cabbage, where he was hiding, and he snapped up the sword in a trice. The princess gave a loud shriek when she set eyes on the dwarf, but the little man, who knew well what a treasure the sword was, just uttered 2 magic words, with the weapon in his hand, and there appeared 2 terrible giants, who at once